Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm about to check in on my bin that I refer to as my mixed bin, because as you can see on the label, it's a combination of red wigglers, European night crawlers, and blue worms in this container. And as you might notice, the label on the container right next to it indicates the same thing: red wigglers, European night crawler, blue worms. The container on the left is actually what had been the cocoon nursery of the material that the worms in the right container were removed from. And I held on to the castings. I allowed time for the cocoons to emerge, and during our last check-in here 12 days ago, we did what we imagined to be the final extraction of baby worms out of the cocoon nursery bin, moving them over into the main bin. And that's the reason I'm running the system at this point with the label flipped upside down, just indicating that that's pretty much a dormant bin at this point, doing really nothing more than just storing the castings at this point. It's just, I don't know, I covered it up to keep moisture in. It seems to be doing pretty nicely doing that. I just saw all this paper that was stuck to the plastic, and for a moment I questioned what that was. I forgot that a bunch of paper had stuck to the plastic. But we're going to be checking in on the main bin now. We're feeding it a pretty routine kind of feeding of various things that I've got right here in my other hand. It's coffee, which is a pretty staple item, as well as an assortment of different frozen stuff that's in this bag here. I've even got a few soiled paper towels that I've been putting aside, and these are all going to get placed into the bin today. The feeding that they got last time, it was a lot of stuff that I think should probably be gone by now, lettuce leaves, things like that, but there were also some corn cob bits in there. I'm sure we're going to still see remnants of those food bits in there as leftovers. So why don't we get this system up on the bench and proceed with today's feeding. So now, for those of you who've been following along closely on my channel, you might already know that this here is going to be my last bin that I needed to tend to after getting back from vacation to get myself caught up. So at this point, all the systems that I've got have gotten checked in on, gotten fed, all that other stuff after me being away for about a week. And since this was the last one that I checked in on before leaving on vacation, this one was the last one to get checked in on since I've been back. And now it gives me a little bit of a hiatus, a couple days off, to not have to worry about making sure that all my bins have what they need. And I had tried to set up the most recent feedings before going away so that they'd be somewhat heftier feedings, not knowing how long it would be before I'd be back into these systems. So 12 days have passed since I fed this bin, and that's kind of a broken record at this point on my channel. I had built a little bit of a schedule to make sure that I was on top of getting back into each of my systems in a reasonable amount of time, and it just worked out in such a way that there was going to be about a 12-day gap in between the most recent feeding and the first feeding that the bins would get after my return from vacation. And I guess the last check-in on this bin was kind of an interesting one. We had already, like I mentioned earlier, migrated the last of the collected baby worms out of the nursery bin, which was kind of interesting. We had checked in on the feeding that the bin had received previously, 2 feedings ago, because that last feeding prior to the most recent one had included a number of oddball items, such as a pile of rice versus a pile of bread. So it was kind of a face-off to see how the different starchy foods that the bin had received previously would do against one another. I think the consensus on that was that the worms seemed to take a shine to both of them pretty equally. It didn't seem like one or the other had dominated over the other. What have we here? This must be a mango seed. I think I just skimmed through the video last night just to give myself a brief refresher on how things went in here last time. I don't think I actually sat down and watched the entire video I made of the last check-in on this bin. So maybe I'll have a couple little twists and turns and surprises as we work our way into this system. This is a little bit unusual. Usually when you poke into one of these old mango husks, the seed inside is a pretty popular item that the worms are usually quite drawn to, and it just seems unusual that within this mango seed there are still remnants of the seed itself that the worms have not yet devoured, making me wonder why. Maybe there's just more interest in some of the other foods that the bin was fed last time. So last time it was coffee, and I think I'm even seeing some remnants of the coffee that was placed in here last time. Some of these lighter colored powdery kind of materials are probably coffee. Perhaps there's just not enough moisture in this feeding area. Perhaps the worms are drawn to a more damp spot in the bin. Maybe that's why we're not seeing quite as much action around the food that was most recently applied. Some of the stuff I'm bumping into is just shreds of paper, cardboard, newspaper, leaves, whatever, mostly bedding stuff that's been kind of the focus of my feedings lately, making sure that I include lots and lots of bedding. So in addition to those paper towel pieces that we are going to include with today's feeding, I've also got some other supplementary bedding materials over here on the side. I've got a bunch of shredded paper as well as some leaves that I was going to include with today's feeding. And a lot of times lately I've been checking in on the bins before coming down here with the food, try to size up the feeding requirement before tapping into my supply of frozen stuff in my freezer to kind of gauge what's needed before determining the portion to give them. This time I just sort of took the approach of assuming that the bin would probably need some food after 12 days since the most recent feeding, so I just grabbed a portion that seemed realistic and just came down here prepared in such a way that I wouldn't have to shoot back upstairs to get food when the time comes to place the food in here. And as I make my way down to the bottom, it does feel to me like the material is perhaps a little bit drier than it needs to be in here. This side appears to be a little bit more damp, and as a result of that, it seems like we've got a pretty good worm population over on this side where it's a little bit more damp. But on the side that's closer to me, it seemed like things were a little bit more dry and the material seemed to be a bit devoid of worm activity. Hopefully the materials that we're going to give them in today's feeding are going to emit some moisture and help dampen the material in this bin a bit. Because while it's not dangerously dry, it is a bit drier than it needs to be, I believe. There's also, let's make sure we don't have any little guys crawling out of the container. I guess the other thing is, if you're a regular on my channel, you'll be aware of the fact that recently I've been making an attempt to try to make sure that my bins all get a good, healthy, ample supply of airflow down within the bedding, within the system. So to try to ensure that, I've been, number one, covering only with paper and cardboard, as you saw when I opened up the bin, as opposed to covering with plastic, which had been my common theme on almost all my systems. The plastic coverings do a wonderful job keeping the moisture within the bin, but I was trying to transition to coverings that would permit a greater amount of airflow, leading me to the paper and cardboard covering approach. So I guess if I really wanted to see if I can try to hold a lot more moisture within the system between feedings, I could potentially opt to cover up with plastic maybe for a week or a week and a half between now and the next feeding. But I don't think things are quite at that level that I need to react. I also try to lately, another little guy is trying to crawl out of the bin. That I think might be one of the night crawlers. It's one of the larger worms in the system. There's really speedy ones, the ones where the clitellum is barely visible. The clitellum being that bulge on the worm's body. Those, I believe, are the blue worms. There's red wigglers in here too, as far as I understand it. So yeah, I guess I'm making note of things just so they maybe stick in my mind and I maybe remember for the next time. So I think it is important to sort of reinforce the observations in your mind so you either retain them mentally, or in my case, I guess I could always revisit my videos, which I often do before feeding, so that if it's a persistent problem that possibly becomes worse over time, you can address it. So I'm not going to react to the fact that I think the materials in here are possibly a little bit dry. I'm going to, make a mental note of it. And if it does seem to me like it does require some sort of a reaction or intervention, then, maybe at a future point I could either, add moisture, perhaps spray some water down into the system, or try to prevent evaporation out of the system by covering up with something that won't allow for the evaporation to occur. But for this go around, I'm simply going to make note of it, and if need be, perhaps next time react to it. But for now, I think we're going to be okay as far as just sticking to our normal game plan of putting in the bedding and the food and not worrying too much about it. Here, I spilled a little bit of coffee on the counter before, so I used that soiled paper towel to clean up with. And these soiled paper towels are still even damp from when they had been used not too long ago. So I like to try to put some of these sort of things aside rather than trashing them, because they're just as good as any other carbon-based bedding materials that you would normally use to supplement the feedings in your systems. So here's, the feeding that we peeked in on earlier. It's a little bit hard to see what we have here today because it's within this plastic bag. This is another portion of, again, if you're following, I guess this is probably the third or fourth time I'm rehashing the same occurrence, but for anyone who's not been keeping up, the freezer that I keep all my worm food in, as well as all the human food in, that the freezer door was left open a certain amount when I went away on vacation for a week. Although I'm not even certain if it was for a whole week, because my mom did pop in over here while I was away, and she's suspecting that she may have actually left the door ajar. I don't know. I can't say for sure. Either the door was left ajar for the entire week because I left it that way, or maybe it was only left ajar for a few days, but I guess it was enough to allow for the majority of the stuff in the freezer to pretty much thaw out. So these things had been sitting in the freezer as future worm food. They all had been frozen and then they thawed out, and now they've been frozen again. And it just seems like it gave everything this sort of really gray appearance. A lot of times the frozen foods that I add have kind of a nice vivid color, almost the way they looked when they were put into the freezer. But if stuff freezes, thaws out, gets refrozen, I guess it starts to take on kind of a perhaps not so appealing appearance. Although, we as humans do take into consideration the appearance of the things that we're consuming, I got a feeling that the worms are not going to worry too much about it. After all, they don't really have eyes, do they? So now let's follow the theme that I've been doing in all my feedings lately, which is plentiful amounts of bedding. So in addition to the paper towels that we laid down underneath the food as bedding, we're going to drop in some shredded newspaper here. We also dropped in some of this aged leafy material. And I do have a supply of more of this stuff, but you know what? Let's use even more of this aged stuff to sort of mix in with the newspaper to see if we can maybe prevent the newspaper from matting up against itself. Because if you just throw in a bunch of newspaper, it does seem to have that tendency to sort of mat up against itself and become kind of clumpy. So I think somewhere between the chunks of leaves being mixed in with the newspaper as well as this coffee, I think that's the sort of stuff that could potentially prevent the newspaper from clumping. So that's kind of a nice mixture there of bedding and coffee, food, all kinds of good stuff, as well as the grit that I threw in there. The powdery stuff that you saw me dropping in was the crushed eggshell that I use as grit. Some people use pulverized crustacean shells, sand, any rock dust maybe, any sort of coarse, tiny particle materials, or what we worm farmers refer to as the grit when we're adding it to our worm farms, because it serves that purpose of going into the worm's digestive system with the foods that it eats to aid in the breakdown of the foods in their gizzards. You know, gizzard is that kind of muscle organ similar to our stomachs, but our stomachs use acid to break the foods down, whereas the gizzard just uses mechanical force, muscular force, along with some coarse materials to break down the foods that are being consumed. So even though I often include grit with most of my feedings, I don't always, but I figured let's just do so here on this go around. All right, so I think I pretty much returned all of the bits of leftover food we encountered on the way in. Those little chunks of corn cob, but there certainly wasn't much else. I mean, there was that, I don't know where it ended up, there was that mango seed as well. I don't remember if we set it aside or if it's already made its way back down into the feeding area. I usually try to keep the foods that I apply somewhat submerged below the surface so that they don't end up potentially attracting, oh, here we go. It's the mango seed, we'll throw that in there too. I like to try to cover up the foods that I put into my worm bins so that I don't end up attracting any sort of insects or whatever into my bins. I'm in my basement here, so it's not like I've got any sort of major insect population down here in my wormery. I think it's sort of a better safe than sorry approach. Let's also mix in a little bit of bedding over here onto the edges of the bin too. A little bit of leafy material, a little bit of paper scraps. Just a good variety of different things throughout the bin. It seemed like we saw a few worms hanging out on the outer edges over on that side. Perhaps we'll see the same over here too. Let's take a peek before we cover things up. Yeah, here we've got a pretty good collection of worms too. Here too, I wonder if it's possibly because maybe the material over here is a little bit more damp. It does feel a little bit more damp over here. Yeah, there seems to be kind of a mix of damp materials and dry materials. What seems odd to me is how the materials right where I had applied the most recent feeding seemed to be somewhat drier than what we're seeing out here on the outer edges. So, whatever, I think we'll do the same. We'll introduce a little bit more bedding over into these outer edges too, spreading the stuff around pretty thoroughly throughout. While it's really nice to, you know, encounter a bunch of almost bedding only out here on the outer edges, I figured, you know, let's try to help some of this bedding material also break down by spreading it around so that the worms all over the place can get at it and make use of it and help break it down. Because it's not only bedding, it's the carbon balance, if you will, to the typical kitchen scraps that they're fed. Because the kitchen scraps that they're fed are really nitrogen-rich kind of foods, and all of the bedding materials that you use also become food, but they're more carbon heavy as far as kind kind of balance between the two in the worm's diet, and they do need both. Again, we've got a worm trying to crawl out, so it's at that point I think to myself, you know, why don't we stop torturing these little guys? Let's cover things back up here, let them resume their work, breaking stuff down. But before we cover up here, I always, at least recently, if I've got leaves on hand, I like to try to cover things up pretty thoroughly. And you know, this bin at this point being 81 days of age, I believe, is kind of approaching that point in time when I would possibly start withholding the application of fresh leaves, mainly because of these sticks, the stems of the leaves. Once the leafy material gets consumed, what's left behind is little sticks that appear to take quite a bit longer in most cases, at least in my bins. So I try to prevent the application of slow composting materials and items such as the stems of leaves, and as a result of that, just the application of leaves themselves from my more mature bins, because I just don't want to end up with a bin full of this stuff when I've got almost all pure castings and then a bunch of leaf stems scattered throughout it. It's usually at this point when I start thinking about maybe transitioning away from slower composting items and focusing more on giving the bin stuff that I know is going to break down a little bit more rapidly. Hopefully, you know, resulting in a batch of really nice fine compost that doesn't have all kinds of other materials littering it. So I think things look pretty good here. It is a little bit tempting to try to help boost the moisture level in here by maybe putting plastic coverings on here, but I'm going to, like I said earlier, I'm going to resist the urge to try to do that. In the past, I would have probably done so in a heartbeat, but I'm trying to transition away from plastic coverings in most of my active bins in the interest of maximizing airflow within the system. But if we do find that things continue to dry in here, then we could always use plastic to try to hold the moisture in, help it circulate, and keep things nice and damp for the worms. But I'm not gonna react to this right away. Perhaps next time if we feel it's necessary. But other than that slightly dry bit of material we saw down the middle, what the heck is this? All right. Just some sort of little insect that's coming by to take advantage of the foods in here, I assume. Luckily, I haven't seen too much weird insect behavior in my bins, but when I do spot the sort of creature I wouldn't really want to see running wild in my basement, I sometimes try to squash them, if I can catch them. In that case, I was unable to catch them. But that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.